So I'm here today to present our work looking at user perceptions of discrimination in online targeted advertising. And this was work I did with Angelisa and Michelle Mazurek at the University of Maryland, as well as with Michael Tschantz from ICSE. So just to review, most of us know what online targeted advertising is, but it's this process of using information that's been collected about users' digital habits to make inferences about their demographics and preferences, and then target advertisements that we think they would like to them. And a lot of times, especially in the security and privacy community, we talk about wanting to avoid having these inferences made and avoid even getting advertised to. But it can sometimes be a bad thing when you don't get a targeted ad. What if you're looking for a new medication and the algorithm just doesn't think you can afford it, so you don't see the ad at all? Or what if you're looking for a new job, but because of something it thinks about you, you don't see the highest paying options? So the inferences that get made can have a lot of real world impacts. And some recent work on search results has shown this. So based on biased input data and different inferences the algorithm makes without really knowing what's going on, Google's been struggling with the fact that some inferences are made like black men are losers or black men are failures. And this isn't good, and we need a way to correct this and also understand where what's going wrong is going wrong. In the ad space, some work by one of my co-authors found that Google's algorithm was sharing more prestigious job ads to men than to women. So men were seeing job ads for 200K jobs while women weren't. And this was, again, potentially based on inference mistakes or on bidding mistakes. It's a bit of a black box, so we're not exactly sure. But what hasn't been looked at a lot is how people feel about these kinds of things, and what parts of the situation make them feel better or worse. And while their opinions are only one part of a very big puzzle, it's important for helping policymakers and tech companies understand where to send their resources first about what people think is the biggest problem. This is also helpful to understand for activists who may want to help people understand why these kinds of things are a problem and how they're going to affect their life in the future so that they care about them now. And so we wanted to take a look at how people reacted to these kinds of scenarios when we varied different factors. And to do this, we used what's called a scenario survey. So I'm going to read this scenario to you and then pop in some different explanations. So Systeme is a local technology firm that develops software. They're expanding and they want to hire new employees. So they contract with Bezo Media, who's an online ad buyer or ad network, to help them place their job ad on a local news website. As a result of something that happened in this process, the ad is shown more often to individuals who are Asian than to individuals who are white. Now, what if I pop in an explanation here? What if this happened because an HR employee at the tech company asked to target individuals who are Asian rather than those who are white? How do you react to that versus the tech company requested that the ad be shown to viewers who have recently visited technology interest websites? They're a tech company, they want to hire people interested in technology, they think that's the way to do it. But it turns out that individuals of a certain race visit those websites more often than people who are white. And so the same outcome happens, but for a different reason. We can take another one. What if it wasn't even a human who made any sorts of decisions? What if the ad buyer charges less to reach these folks who are Asian, and Systeme's marketing computer program, not a person, decided to take the cheapest option? And finally, as an example, what if the tech company wasn't involved at all? What if the ad buyer was completely responsible? So the ad buyer knows from their prior data that those who are Asian tend to click on different ads than those who are white, and their automated system wants to make the client happy and get them the most clicks they can, and so they target those folks rather than people who are white. How do people react to these things? How do they consider the ethics of each of the players in the situation? And how do they rank the responsibility of who caused this to happen and who should be held liable? So to get a little bit more into our methodology, we looked at a bunch of different entities. So we have the company trying to hire, we have the ad buyer who's helping them place the ad, we have a local news website that the ad is appearing on, and then we have the end user who's maybe making some sort of behavior like clicking on technology interest websites or who has some demographic feature. In our initial work, we also looked at whether it mattered whether it was race, political leaning, maybe the HR employee wants to hire people who are Republican over people who are Democrat, age, or medical condition. We wanted to understand whether the mechanism mattered. Does it matter that an algorithm decided? Algorithm wants the cheapest thing, great, or the human decided. And finally, does it matter if it was based on your behavior, your clicking patterns, or based explicitly on your demographics? And so to take a look at this, we started out with a pilot survey, because this is a lot of variations. And we wanted to try to narrow down to what would be the most important things to look at. So in order to do this, we had a 72 condition survey with the targets I just mentioned: human versus algorithm, behavior versus demographics, different kinds of races, so on. And then we also had 9 explanations varying these conditions, as well as a control. We derived the explanations that we used from previous work from our co-authors and from others on this sort of targeted bias to make sure it was as ecologically valid as possible. We also tested our survey in what's called cognitive interviews. So we brought in people and had them think aloud while they took the survey to make sure they were understanding the language consistently and that they understood what we were explaining to them. We then iteratively updated the survey to make sure it made sense. And then finally, we collected a near census representative sample of US users. So this means the demographics of our sample population very closely resemble the demographics in the US. And the reason we cared about this is that a lot of our questions deal with demographics, and so if we have a skewed population, we're not going to get very good answers. This was collected by a survey provider. It was online, and there were 988 people who took it, so about 16 to 17 per condition. So what did we find out? First, we found out some things about how people feel about who's the target of the discrimination, based on health status, political, race, age. And very slightly, we see that race was the thing people felt most strongly about. So political and race were stronger than health and age, and race was the strongest. And there are a lot of sociological explanations for this reaction, but for our work, we were mainly interested in getting sort of an upper bound on how people feel. And so moving forward in our later work, we stuck with race to elucidate the strongest reactions. We also looked at how people felt about behavioral targeting versus demographic targeting. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we found that people felt that behavioral targeting was slightly less of a problem than demographic, where the orange colors are more of a problem and the green colors are less. And then finally, we had thought that whether it was a human versus an algorithm making the decision would matter. Maybe algorithms would be seen as more objective or less of an issue. But we didn't really see this in our initial results. We did keep this factor anyways to see if, when we had more participants per condition, something popped out. So for our final survey, we ended up sticking with race, and we had 3 targets. So whether someone who is white, someone who is Asian, or someone who is black benefited. We had 8 explanations that varied this human algorithm, demographic versus behavioral, and also who was given responsibility for what happened. So either Systeme, the tech company that was hiring, had made the decision, or Bezo, the place placing the ads, had made the choice. And this resulted in 24 conditions. And then what did we ask people? So we asked them about the degree to which they thought each of those entities was responsible for what happened. And this is sort of important, as I said, for policy making and also for corporations to know when people are planning to hold them responsible so that they can start to mitigate that. We asked them the degree to which the situation in the scenario was a problem. And we finally asked them the degree to which they felt like the behavior of each of the entities was ethical. And at the very end of the survey, we asked them whether they felt like the scenario could happen in real life to make sure that they weren't just giving sort of random responses about something that was very imaginary to them. And while there can certainly be some social desirability bias here, we had high enough agreement that it was believable that we went forward with the results. So before getting to our final results, we generated some training data. So we're planning to use logistic regression models in order to analyze these results. And so we wanted to fit them on an initial data set before using them on the final one. So in order to do that, we collected a small, somewhat biased mTurk sample that we felt would be good enough to build the models, but certainly not to generate results. And as I said, we used logistic regression. So we were trying to model people's reactions to the scenarios based on the features that we varied, plus their demographics. And finally, we tried multiple models to find the one with the best fit using the AIC criterion. And in cases where multiple models had a similar fit, we picked the one that retained our experimental factors. And so then we did our final analysis. And to make sure that the models we fit on the final data set, we checked the random mean squared error. And this final analysis was on, again, a census representative sample. So what did we find out? Do people think this is a problem? So 44% rated it as a severe to moderate problem. And this significantly differed depending on whether it was based on behavior or demographics. So if the targeting happened because of behavior, the median rating was somewhat problem. If it happened based on demographics, it was a moderate problem. So a 1-point jump on a 4-point Likert scale, which is fairly large. Surprisingly, we found there was, again, no difference depending on whether it was a human or an algorithm making the decision. So this is interesting because one of the defenses that has been used in the past is, oh, we didn't do it and we didn't know. But it seems like this is not enough. So more work needs to be done on what these algorithms are doing and how to make them less biased. It's not sufficient to just say, oh, I didn't know about it. So what makes it more or less of a problem? So we found that when the group benefiting is a minority, it was rated as less of a problem. And this makes sense given that our sample was in the US and given our complicated racial history. It was also less of a problem, as I mentioned, when it happened based on behavior, and also when the person taking the survey was older, possibly proxying for conservative beliefs. Those who had higher education rated this as more of a problem, and if the person taking the survey was Black, it was also more of a problem. Again, maybe speaking to our complicated racial history, and with higher education, maybe differing beliefs about where responsibility lies. So digging a little bit more again into this demographics for behavior, we see a pretty significant shift in terms of what's a moderate or serious problem in the orange or even a minor problem. So let's talk about responsibility. So how responsible is each entity? So the advertiser and the ad buyer are held very responsible and almost equally responsible no matter who was named in the scenario. So 17%, only 17%, thought the advertiser was not responsible, and only 18% thought the ad buyer or the ad network was not responsible. So this also means that in addition to not being able to say, oh, I didn't do it, it was an algorithm, finger pointing to say the other person did it may not be super effective. The local news website, only 58% thought they were responsible, which is a decent percentage, but they're not held terribly responsible. And then 63% thought the user was not responsible. And this sort of depends on the condition. So in the behavior condition, people are more likely to hold the user responsible, and they hold them pretty much equally responsible as they hold the local news website. So this is sort of interesting in that people may not even realize their behavior is being tracked, but others think they're responsible for the outcomes of that behavior. So what made the ad buyer, who is helping them place the ad, more or less responsible? Again, if it happened based on behavior, if the respondent was older, or if the scenario mentioned the advertiser, they were very slightly held less responsible. Again, if the respondent was Black, held more responsible, maybe complicated racial factors here. When it was the tech company itself, really the only factors that affected it to reduce it was whether it happened based on behavior, and to increase it was whether the scenario named them as responsible. And again, very, very slight effect there. When was the local news website held more responsible? The only factor that affected that was that older respondents tended to think the website was less responsible. Could be conservative values or different understandings of how the technology works. And finally, when is the end user held more or less responsible? The end user is held less responsible when the person responding is older, but interestingly held more responsible when the respondent is more educated. And that was particularly true for the behavior condition. So it seems that those who are more educated, who maybe understand more about the technology, place more responsibility on the side of the user for not protecting themselves from these kinds of things, which is sort of interesting going forward in terms of activism. How do we get people who are in different parts of the educational spectrum to understand what tools they can use and how they can protect themselves? And then finally, we took a little bit of a look at ethics. And what we saw was a lot of kind of neutral ratings. So 49% thought the advertiser, the tech company, behaved ethically. 43% thought the ad buyer behaved ethically. 57% thought the ad host behaved ethically. And then 75% thought the user behaved ethically, and the rest were sort of neutral. And what we got out of a lot of this is that ethics is a really complicated question. And it's not something that we ask end users terribly often. It's usually sort of a legal question or an academic question. And so we saw kind of in this data and also in our cognitive interviews that people really struggled to answer this question. And so what this might imply is that a lot of these ethics questions are sort of on us as a community or on policymakers to address based on how people feel about other things and based about what's going on in reality. But end users may not be fully equipped to answer these kinds of questions. And so kind of to that point, the only factors we saw that affected whether the entity's behavior was more or less ethical was, again, if it happened based on behavior versus demographics. And we saw nothing affecting whether the end user's behavior was more or less ethical, largely because everything was on the neutral to ethical side. So in summary, what did we just talk about? We talked about perceptions of the severity of discrimination in targeted advertising. And so we found that biased situations in which minorities benefit are seen as less problematic, which sort of makes sense in the environment that we're in. And then we also found that some minority groups find the scenarios more problematic overall, no matter who is benefiting. And that's sort of interesting for activism and policymakers going forward, is it doesn't necessarily matter that my group is benefiting or losing. It matters how I feel about this overall. And finally, we found that the decision mechanism doesn't matter for our measured variables. So whether it was a human or an algorithm doing it, wasn't very important. It was largely about how it was happening and a little bit about who was benefiting. And finally, that finger pointing between the advertiser and the ad buyer isn't necessarily helpful. Because if I'm a company placing my ad with a company that's helping me place it most effectively, users are going to hold both of us responsible, even if I didn't tell them to do anything. And that's it. Thank you.
If anybody has questions for our presenter, please, there's 2 mics here. Come up to the microphone, state your name, and ask your question.
Hi, Phoebe Rouge from the FTC. It's kind of interesting to me that the decision mechanism didn't really matter, because I think a big solution to a lot of this is often put forward is to just decrease the transparency of how these decisions are being made. So do you feel that that's probably not necessarily an effective way to do things, or do you have any suggestions on ways to mitigate, how people feel about this so that we go in the right direction with this?
Sure. Yeah, so I think we also kind of came at it from that perspective. And it seemed like the answer was no. But what I do wonder with transparency, if that would help people understand that they need to be more proactive with adopting tools so that they can avoid some of this. So I think it could have that impact, but I think it needs to be paired with some sort of actionable set of steps you can take versus just, here's what's happening, because they seem to be like, yeah, it's bad. Great. Thank you for telling me. Yeah, so I think pairing it with education.
Thank you.
Great. So
Thanks.
I got some questions too. So I think that one thing that was, all of this was very interesting. One of the things that kind of stuck in my mind is this, that do people actually understand the differences between algorithms and humans? Do people even understand what an algorithm is? I feel like we're so biased because we live and breathe this stuff, but I feel like, people who aren't technology and computer scientists maybe don't even conceptualize that. Do you have thoughts about that, or?
Yeah, sure. So that was one of the things we were very interested in when we were testing the survey, and they seem to have somewhat of an understanding in the sense that they knew that something automatically came up with this based on something else, and that there wasn't a person. And that was sort of what we gathered was their understanding, and so we kind of went forward with that as okay, this is acceptable, but I think that's actually kind of going back to the question about FTC things. Part of the education is also what are these things really, and how do they make decisions, and how do you get to have a voice in how they make those kind of decisions? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Jeremy Epstein, NSF. Follow-up to that, do the people who understand sort of what an algorithm is, do they understand that algorithms are created by humans and are not just this magical thing that appears from nowhere?
Yeah, so our sample for this is relatively small, and I think it's an interesting question we should look at for future work. It seems sort of split in that some of them realized that someone at the company built this algorithm based on something from the past, and some of them thought they came out of magical boxes. It didn't seem to have a strong correlation with like internet skill, which was sort of interesting. So I think we need to figure out what is related to understanding this better.
Right, because it's obvious to everyone in this room that an algorithm can be built in a deliberately biased way. The fact that it's an algorithm doesn't mean that it is inherently biased or inherently unbiased. And I worry that we're sometimes using that as a crutch to say, oh, it's not our problem, it's just an algorithm.
Yeah, and I think to some degree these sort of speak to that in terms of like people didn't really care, they just cared what the outcome was and what was put into it. So I think they may have that understanding, but not very saliently.
So since we do have a little bit of time, and a lot of us maybe in this room do more technology, systems building kind of, I mean, we're at like the USENIX security. Can you talk a little bit about the IRB approval process for the study, what that was kind of like?
Sure, yeah. So typically for all of these studies, we will write up kind of what is the goal of the study, why do we think it's important to ask people about this, how are we going to protect their private and sensitive data, and then what exactly are we going to ask them. And then we go through a review process, and the IRB's goal is to make sure that we're not going to make them terribly uncomfortable, that we're giving them an option to opt out or to not respond to any question, and that we're careful about how we protect their information as well as how we analyze it, and making sure we don't share things they've shared with us that would make them identifiable. And the other thing I think that sort of is interesting for us in terms of this kind of work is a lot of the statistics. So there's better and worse ways you can do this, where you can go fishing for features that are going to be important, or you can kind of start out with a hypothesis model, which is what we tried to do here, and then see what pops out. And I think that's something that's always a challenge for us when we do this work, is a lot of times it's exploratory, so we don't know what's going to pop out. But we also have to be very ethical and honest about making sure that we aren't imposing what we think should pop out on top of the data.